to the cloud. And so now everybody knows that we're recording. Tonight, we're going to hear from Rabbi and Dr. and Professor Michael Berenbaum. In a moment, I'm going to, what I'm actually going to do is screen share his extraordinary resume. I am not going to read through all of it because it would take too long. But before I do the formal aspect of that, I just want to say that Michael is going to join us in about 35 or 40 minutes. He is helping to care for his daughter who had a medical appointment. His daughter was my chavruta in rabbinical school. In my first few years of rabbinical school, she and I studied Talmud together. She is now a rabbi, Rabbi Alana Greenblatt, and she has a doctorate in Midrash from UCLA. And Michael was one of my teachers. I also attended the library meeting with him in Los Angeles for many years, shared many Shabbat dinners with him. And I feel very, very privileged to call him a teacher and a friend. Boy, what a treat we have in hearing from him as a way of learning more and observing YomHashoah. So I'm just going to read you a few pieces of this. Michael Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, teacher, and consulting in the conceptual development of museums. So at the AJU, which is my alma mater, he is the director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at American Jewish University. And he's held other faculty positions. He was the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica that reworked and transformed, improved, broadened, and deepened the now classic 1972 work. This is an extraordinary intellectual gift to the Jewish community. For 3 years, he was the president and chief and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. He was the director of the United States Holocaust Research Institute at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and also an adjunct professor of theology at Georgetown. He served as the project director of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, overseeing its creation, and has done so at the Illinois Holocaust Memorial Museum. And he was the chief curator and director of the Balzac Memorial at the site of the death camp, and a whole other host of accomplishments in that area. He's the author and editor of 22 books, scores of scholarly articles, hundreds of journalistic pieces. And he also, in Los Angeles, has worked as a co-producer of One Survivor Remembers, the Gerder Weissman Klein story that won an Academy Award, an Emmy Award, a Cable Ace Award, and has been a historical consultant on dozens of documentaries and films, many of which you probably have seen on HBO's Conspiracy, NBC's Uprising, the History Channel, etc. Swimming in Auschwitz, and a whole host of other things. So we could really just go on and on, but it gives you a sense that we have a tremendous gift in hearing from him. As I said, he's running late to a medical appointment, knew that he was going to be running late, and has recorded a talk for us, which is 38 minutes, and then will come and join us for about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A afterward. And one of the books that he is an author of deals with the question of modern anti-Semitism, and he's going to help us to think about, as he said in his title, why is this YomHashoah different from other YomHashoah days, and to think about the way in which our memory of the Holocaust functions to help us, and maybe to impair our vision as well during modern times. So Rachel Green, who is our amazing communications coordinator, is now going to share her screen and begin playing Professor Berenbaum's talk. So Rachel, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with this congregation. Many years ago, I was scholar in residence in this congregation in Durham. I was there during a beautiful springtime where on Shabbat afternoon, I strolled through Duke Gardens and enjoyed it enormously. And you can be very proud of your rabbi. I've known Rabbi Graber since he was a rabbinical student. He went to school with my daughter. I attended his early neshama minions, and I think you've gotten one of the best. And I'm proud to have known him both as a student and, more importantly, as a friend. I must say that I've just returned from Israel and from Poland. So I'm feeling Yom HaShoah quite differently this year than all other years. What I'd like to share with you is why I feel this Yom HaShoah is different than all other years, and what that represents to us all. In one sense, where you can ask Manishtana, why is this year different from all others? On all of the years, the shadow of genocide did not loom large. Yet on this year, it looms very large in the deeds of President Putin and the Russian army, in the killing fields of the Ukraine, in the mouth of President Biden. On all the years, we worried that the Holocaust may not be remembered, that its victims would be forgotten. On this Yom HaShoah, we are feared that the Holocaust is being invoked too often, too foolishly. And the examples are abundant, too abundant. Gold stars, gazpacho police, masks as yellow stars, even, and the Holocaust, a statement that the Holocaust is not even about racism. On all of the nights, we never imagined the brazenness of those who would like to complete the Holocaust in our own country. This year, we've seen the sweatshirt 6MWE, 6 million wasn't enough. And on the internet, we've seen somebody wearing Auschwitz staff member proudly in the office of the Capitol that was overtaken by insurrectionists. On all of the nights, we feared that certain countries would never confront their nation's participation in perpetrating crime. And this year, we have an active campaign, literally, to rewrite the history, casting all blames on the Germans, absolving their own nation of active participation. So this year we have to sit together to remember in a certain different spirit. Jews know that remembrance is dependent on time and place. How do we know it? We know it from the Psalms. By the waters of Babylon, we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. We know it from the notion that the place from which you remember an event shapes how you remember it. And we are at a very special moment. We're the last to live in the presence of survivors, and we live almost at a fading distance from the event itself. We also are those who are going to mark the transition, because soon, all too soon, we're going to not have the last survivor with us. So we're going to mark the transition from living memory to historical memory. We're also living in a time of enormous turmoil, and also in a time of great anti-Semitism. We have dreamed. I have a dream, and the dream that I have is that I wish that I were irrelevant. What do I mean by that? That when we created the United States Holocaust Memorial, we thought that the ideal ending would be that we could describe the events of the Holocaust and say 21st century humanity could not do that, would not do that, is not like that. But the problem is that we've found the Holocaust of continuous relevance, of abiding memory, and also of abiding interest. We have to now ask different questions than we asked 20, 25 years ago. We ask questions of the periods of 1918 to 1933. How does a democratic government move toward an autocratic and ultimately a totalitarian government? How does a society become so polarized that there is the collapse of the center, that political opponents become adversaries? How do we live in a world in which there are wars of aggression by superpowers, and also in which there are superpowers that are committing crimes against humanity? We live in a world where the Holocaust is invoked falsely. The good news is that the Holocaust is remembered. And the other good news is that we have already established the Holocaust as the gold standard, the landmark of evil. In one sense, we can say that in a world of relativism, everybody understands that we may not know what's good, we may not know what's bad, but we know for certain that the Holocaust was absolute evil, and that's why it's invoked. It's invoked again and again. Our success is that it's the gold standard of evil. Our failure is that it's invoked in ways that are not acceptable. Imagine President Putin calls the government of President Zelensky a Nazi regime. Jewish president whose grandparents fought against the Nazis and whose grandparents were killed by the Nazis, who has another Jewish member of the cabinet. And imagine also that the hero of the world is a Ukrainian Jew at this moment, something unimaginable. We have comparisons that are false. The masks were compared to yellow stars. Yellow stars were what we call in the field symbolization, to symbolize someone, to mark them for extinction. And the reason Jews were marked is because our identity is not visible outwardly. It's not like having black skin. It's not like having the eyes of an Asian. It's not like having red skin or brown skin. So Jews had to be marked because only when you mark them could you discriminate against them actively. And the masks which were used to protect human beings were compared to silver stars. There's a tragic cartoon. There's a tragic cartoon which invokes the gates of Auschwitz, Arbeit macht frei. And what it says is vaccines make you safe, as if it's the big lie. You see gas chambers in the background and vaccines which are designed to save people's lives, which are a modern medical miracle, and one of the ways in which we're going to put the COVID crisis behind us. Vaccines have been compared to the gas chambers of Auschwitz. We have ignorance. One congressperson spoke about gold stars as if the Jews were marked with gold scars. She spoke about gazpacho police, not understanding the difference between gazpacho and the Gestapo. We have sometimes ignorance without malice. Whoopi Goldberg said that the Holocaust was not about racism because she understood racism in terms of black and white, not understanding that Jews were defined biologically based on the religion of their grandparents, that they were essentially not defined by the identity they had, the beliefs they embraced, the practices that they regarded as sacred, but by the accident of their birth with some Jewish blood within them. Let me give you a concrete example of that. I studied with a great Protestant theologian, Eugen Rosenstock, UC. Eugen Rosenstock Jussi was a Protestant theologian from 1913 to 1933 in Germany and from 1940 to 1967 in the United States. Between 1935 and 1940, a believing Christian, a great Protestant theologian, was defined by the society in which he lived as a Jew. We also live at a time in which there is deliberate misrepresentation of the Holocaust, misrepresentation of the Holocaust in order to exonerate the locals from their participation in the evil. And in Poland, they've made it a civil crime, a civil offense to speak about Poles' participation in the Holocaust, to speak about Polish institutions, even to speak about individual Poles and their participation in the murder of the Jews. In Lithuania, they have revered the heroes of Lithuanian nationalism, not realizing that 66% of the Jews killed in Lithuania were killed not by Germans, but by Lithuanians. And the opposite took place in Romania, where Romania had a commission headed by Elie Wiesel, with a brilliantly able historian by the name of Dr. Radu Ioanid, who used to work with me, who is now the Romanian ambassador to Israel, and an international scholarly model that set up precisely what happened in Romania so there could be no misrepresentation. We live in a time also, and this is a part of our despair, we live in a time in which there is increasing anti-Semitism. So let me talk for a moment about anti-Semitism of our time. I'm going to give you 101, Anti-Semitism 101. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source. Is it political? Is it economic? Is it social? Is it racial? Anti-Semitism differs as to its goal. Is the goal, if it's religious anti-Semitism, the goal is conversion? If it's political anti-Semitism, the goal is the diminishment of Jewish power. And in previous times in history, it's been the expulsion of Jews. If it's social anti-Semitism, it is exclusion. Remember the famous joke by Groucho Marx, who would want to belong, I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. And anti-Semitism also, if it is racial, ended up being the goal of the Nazis was not elimination of the Jews, but ultimately what they called extermination of the Jews, what we call annihilation. Anti-Semitism also differs with regard to how high a priority it is in society. One of the reasons we American Jews have been protected all along is that anti-Semitism was never the first priority of American hatred. Anti-Semitism was second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth priority of hatred, never first, never foremost. In Nazi Germany, the elimination of the Jews became the central focus of the society. And one can argue that the Germans conducted two wars, the World War and the war against the Jews. And they succeeded far more ably in the war against the Jews than they did in the World War. Anti-Semitism also varies by the nature of a society in crisis. It's an axiom. The more secure, the more stable a society is, the more secure Jews are. And we live in a time in which there are multiple crises. One, clearly we've had a health crisis. The health crisis triggered an economic crisis. We have a political crisis with people denying a fair and open election. We have a polarization of society in which there is us and them. And let me remind you that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Delano Roosevelt came to power at the same time. Adolf Hitler essentially turned the society one against another, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned the society one toward another. So the idea of polarization is something that is enormously dangerous in any society, and particularly dangerous to Jews. We live in a time where there is a crisis of truth, and that is that people, General Patrick Moynihan used to say, everybody's entitled to their opinion, but people are not entitled to their set of facts. And now we believe that there is an entitlement to one set of facts. We live in a society in which there is also a global climate crisis, and whether and how we handle it may determine the future of our grandchildren. Why is this anti-Semitism different from all other anti-Semitisms? To ask it in another Passover way. Or let's ask it a second way, which is, why is this not our fathers or our grandfathers' anti-Semitism? And the answer to that is, number one, we have the internet, and the internet is a megaphone. The internet is a megaphone which allows an isolated individual to have a global reach. We have social networks, which does not isolate the hater, but actually empowers the hater to find a community of those who are like them, who support them, who endorse them, and who reinforce them. We also live at a time in which there is a climate of hatred. Those of us who are my age grew up in a time where if you felt anti-Semitic, you couldn't express it. You may feel it, but you don't say it. If you felt racist, you also couldn't say it. Nazism had discredited anti-Semitism, and the whole civil rights march and the civil rights movement had discredited certain forms of racism. But we now live at a time where if you believe it, you can say it, and in fact, it's regarded as more authentic to express hatred. The political guardrails are off, and hatred is easily expressed. Not all news is bad, however, and we have to emphasize this. And if we're discussing anti-Semitism, we have to speak about the progress that has been made in the post-Holocaust world. Number one, there's been dramatic change in Christianity. Let's use Roman Catholicism as an example. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the popes that dealt with the Holocaust transformed the potentially anti-Semitic traditions of Christianity. John the 23rd, now Saint John the 23rd, examined the roots of anti-Semitism in Christianity, studied with a great French scholar by the name of Jules Isaac. And when he became Pope, he convened Vatican II, and Vatican II ended the charge of deicide by saying that if Christ died for our sins, the reason for the murder of the Jews was, the reason for the murder of Jesus was not the Jews, but the reason for the murder of Jesus was human sin. No sin, no need for the crucifixion, because no need for the sacrificial atonement. His successor, once removed, now Saint John Paul II, was the first pope in the entire history of Christianity. And remember, Jews lived in Rome before Christianity even was established, before the birth of Christ. And when Jews lived in Rome, no pope had ever visited a synagogue, yet alone prayed in one. And what did Pope John the 23rd do? He went to a synagogue in Rome and he prayed there, greeting the rabbi as a friend and a fellow religious leader, rather than as an embarrassment to the triumph of Christianity. Pope John Paul II also recognized the state of Israel, which means if Pope John the 23rd had come to terms with 1,878 years of Jewish history, Pope John Paul II came to terms with the future of Jewish history, which includes dramatically the state of Israel. And he did one other thing that was astounding. He went on a visit to Israel He went to the Western Wall, which normally for Christians had previously been a symbol of what the abandonment by God of the Jewish people, because if God didn't abandon the Jewish people, why would the most sacred temple of the Jews be destroyed? It had been a symbol of the abandonment of the Jews, and he put a letter into the wall, a kvittel, essentially apologizing for the anti-Semitism of Christians, and did not of Christianity, but of Christians, in a grand gesture that was deeply and profoundly appreciated in Israel. Recent Pope, Pope Francis, the current Pope, took it one more step further. Pope John Paul II also said one more thing, that it should be music to a Jew's ear. He said anti-Semitism is anti-Christian, something we never heard throughout the long, dark years of Christian anti-Semitism. Second element is, and by the way, in Protestantism has made similar changes. You all know of the affection that the evangelicals have for the Jews, because they regard the Jewish return to the land of Israel as the foreshadowing the return of Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. The other element that has collapsed is communism, which used to be a major source of anti-Semitism. And if you don't, you can't imagine it, but in the United States, despite the increase in anti-Semitism, we have a very interesting phenomenon, which Judaism is the most respected religion in America. In both 2014 and 2020, the Pew survey indicated that Judaism is the most respected religion in America, by which I understand it as the least disrespected religion in America. Roman Catholicism has a dramatic problem between the pew and the pews and the altar. Number one, the tremendous discrediting of Roman Catholicism by the behavior of its priests. Number two, Roman Catholics get divorced in precisely the same percentage as the rest of the American population. Roman Catholics practice birth control in the same percentage as the rest of the American population, and they get abortions in only slightly less of a percentage than the rest of the American population. So Roman Catholicism has a deep problem and great divisions in the church, including divisions in which the conservatives in the church are opposed to the current pope, and the liberals have been opposed to previous popes. Dramatic difference. The second element is Protestantism is divided. It's divided between the evangelical and mainstream. And the evangelical community is also divided, ironically, on certain key issues: the identification of the evangelical political leadership and religious leadership with President Trump, with former President Trump. And the second is, interestingly enough, on the gay issue, where the attitude of the younger generation is far more accepting of gays than the attitude of the older generation. My own younger kids don't see a difference between being left-handed and being gay, and they're left-handed. And consequently, that's an age difference throughout Protestantism and throughout evangelical Protestantism. To overgeneralize, people have learned to suspect Muslims and associate Muslims with terrorism and with fanaticism. And people don't understand Eastern religions, so by default, Judaism comes in as the most respected religion. And there may be anti-Semitism, but there is less anti-Judaism. We also have two other pieces of news that are good. The first is that the Abraham Accords are having an impact and may soon have an impact on a diminishment of Muslim anti-Semitism. And that is, the Abraham Accords are an agreement of an elite. They're agreement from the top down. And because they're an agreement from the top down, at one moment, in the case of divorce, you say, when do you tell the children? And at one moment, the leadership of the Muslim communities that have established relations with Israel have to tell their community that Israel is not the source of all evil, and that will have a dramatic and a significant change within Muslim circles. And you understand that there's the division between the Sunni and the Shiites, and the fact that the Sunni are prepared to make peace with Israel and to recognize Israel is going to at least take one segment of the Muslim community and significantly diminish their anti-Semitism. And one can even see that in Saudi Arabia, which has not yet established relations with Israel. And Saudi Arabia has been a source of fanaticism. The agreement with the Saudi king is will allow the fanatical religious to work, most especially abroad. We'll support them, we'll endorse them, as long as we have peace within the kingdom itself. There is a change taking place and a challenge to that type of agreement. Last point, which is also very important in terms of the good news with anti-Semitism, is that we are moving from a resource-based economy to a knowledge-based economy. And knowledge-based economy, not only is Israel a major power, but Israel is a significant power that is included in the knowledge-based economy and integrated into the knowledge-based economy, so that something like BDS cannot work even if it were to be effective. Number one, it's had zero impact on the Israeli economy. Number two, when students come to me and they say they want to support BDS, I say, give me your iPhones, give me your Microsoft programs, give me the medical knowledge that has been pioneering, especially during this era of COVID, and get rid of Intel chips and a whole range of computer technology. And consequently, even the Arabs have come to recognize that they have to train their people for a knowledge-based economy, that education is the key, that women must participate in that, and that they are joining forces with Israel, not so much because they love Jews, as because they want a better future for their people. And that's something that's far more enduring. What do we have to say? Before we used to say never again, but we can't say never again, but we have learned certain things, and we even see certain things developing in our society because of the Holocaust itself. One, in 1938, in September 1938, we had dramatic appeasement of Germany, as the Prime Minister of Britain and the Prime Minister of France gave the Hitler the Sudetenland, and the conference was held between the Prime Minister of France, the Prime Minister of Britain, the Chancellor of Germany, and the Prime Minister of Italy. And there was no Czech participation, no Czechoslovakian participation, democratic government, no participation in decision to divide Czechoslovakia. Notice a very subtle thing that is taking place in American and European policy with regard to the Ukraine, and that is that the Ukraine are an integral part of those people who are around the table. And the policy, the articulated policy of the American government is whatever is acceptable to the Ukrainians is acceptable to the Americans. And consequently, we're avoiding that appeasement, and we're coming to the important defense of the Ukrainian society. Whatever the Ukrainians accept, we will accept. I come back from Warsaw, and I have to tell you that Warsaw itself has received 500,000 Ukrainians. I was in conversation with the head of JCC in Krakow, my good friend Jonathan Orstein. He's feeding 600 meals a day, 600 people a day, 3 meals a day, The door is open. There is availability of food, and what you have is that the Ukrainians are being received. There is virtually nobody in Warsaw, few people in Warsaw who don't have Ukrainians that they are housing, that they are giving shelter to. And the Jews have provided several hotels that are essentially designed for Ukrainian Jews. And there's tremendous support both from the Claims Conference and other sources for the survivors. So we've had an acceptance of refugees in the way in which we could not have imagined before. There's a greater understanding of the role of resistance. We have heroized people like Mordechai Anilevich and the people who rose in rebellion in Warsaw. And I think that has become part and parcel of Zelensky's understanding of his role, which is not to give in. He said what? He said, give me arms and not a ticket. And he's become the tremendous, tremendous example of courage in our time. And finally, we understand the deep danger of the evil that surrounds us. Let's go back and understand something unique about the Holocaust and distinct and why it has become the gold standard. What was unique about the Holocaust and unique about the Jewish faith? The first, and this is where we have to distinguish between the genocide and the Holocaust, the scope of the German determination to kill the Jews. The Germans sought to murder Jews everywhere, men, women, and children. 11 million Jews were targeted for murder at the Wannsee Conference on January 20th. And the goal was to eliminate the Jewish people from the face of the earth. Previous anti-Semitism had varied by source: religious, national, economic, social, political. The Nazis introduced something called racial anti-Semitism. Timothy Snyder, the Yale historian, who's written brilliantly on the recent subjects and also on terror and tyranny, called it zoological anti-Semitism. My colleague and my friend Saul Friedlander, who's a neighbor, spoke of redemptive anti-Semitism. The murder of the Jews was regarded as essential to the well-being of German society. Jews were regarded as a cancer, and consequently their elimination was regarded as a medical matter, much in the same way as you remove the cancerous organ. Anti-Semitism was the single preoccupation of the Germans. There's a seamless record from 1919 to 1930 to 1945 of anti-Semitism from Adolf Hitler. It was his final words to his people in his last will and testament. The Nazis essentially sought to eliminate the Jews with a relentlessness that made it its first priority. They moved from essentially murder by bullets, which took murderous units and sent them to Jews who were murdered adjacent to their home. And when that became too difficult for the Germans, and they had mental breakdowns, they needed alcohol before, during, and after. And in a few cases, you had people who literally collapsed. And by the way, during murder by bullets, no German was ever punished because he refused to participate. None were court-martialed. So they were essentially willing executioners, to use the word of Daniel Goldhagen. But what the Germans then did, which was something extraordinary, was they reversed the process. If you can't send if you can't send mobile killers to stationary victims, the next logical thing is to reverse the process. Even let me use the word reverse the metaphor, and that is you make the victims mobile and you send them to stationary killing centers. What made the victims mobile was the railroad system, and every one of the death camps was built on a railroad line. Treblinka was built on the railroad line between Warsaw and Białystok, and consequently the Jews murdered there were essentially primarily Jews from Warsaw and Białystok and the vicinity along that railroad line. Treblinka and Belzec was the camp in railroad lines in Galicia. Auschwitz had 44 parallel railroad tracks. It was equipped to receive Jews from the four corners of the earth because it had 44 parallel railroad tracks. And interestingly enough, Penn Station only has 21. And consequently, you had the invention of the killing center, the death camp, the murder camp, which combined Charles Darwin's notion of survival of the fittest with Henry Ford's assembly line of murder. The instrumentalities employed by the Germans included death camps, systematic murder, factories, the technology. Ultimately, at Auschwitz, they used Zyklon B. Zyklon B essentially could murder 2,000 people at 1/2 of 1 cent per person over a 30-minute period of time. Many call the Holocaust imaginable, which it once was, but no longer. Humanity is today capable of even greater evil, and unless we value the sanctity and the decency of each human being, the sacredness of each human being, we will never avoid the type of evil that we found. What are we to do with the Holocaust? And here I'm going to conclude. I think the Exodus story, and this is the relationship to Passover, the Exodus story gives us the model. What is the Exodus story? The Exodus story is a historical event that occurred to a particular people that was told and retold. And it was told and retold, and therefore it became the universal symbol of freedom. Everybody understands that there was a Pharaoh. I was once at a Seder where the leader of the Seder said, "You want to have a perfect Seder? Ask everyone, what is their Egypt? Who is their Pharaoh? What is their Moses? And what is the journey into the desert? And ultimately, what is their promised land?" Meaning the story of the Exodus has become a universal story, meant, and because of the Exodus, we have the Sabbath, we have to treat the widow and the orphan properly, we have to enhance and protect human dignity, we have to defend human decency and human compassion. What we're doing with the Holocaust is we're retelling the story to understand that modern humanity is capable of the worst of evil. The Holocaust is where evil can lead, and therefore everybody tries to compare their own experience to the Holocaust as a way of shouting against evil. But the Holocaust tells us the radical importance of human dignity, of human decency, of human courage, and also the possibility of human goodness in the face of unbearable evil. The quality of resistance, the quality of life-saving, and the innate importance of every human life in all of its diversity, in all of its variety, in all of its God-given beauty. That's what we're here for today, to remember the victims, to tell that story, but to tell that story for an ultimate moral purpose. Thank you. And I apologize that we had to do it by Zoom, but I'm dealing with a family emergency, and I hope to come back and be with you for questions. Thank you very much.
So I want to say thank you to Rachel for sharing her screen. And boy, I tell you, Michael, very, very good timing, as we're delighted that you can join us for some question and answer. And I do want to invite people who have their cameras off to turn their cameras on if you're in a place where you're able. Michael, I also began my introduction with just a lot of affection and appreciation for you as a friend and as a teacher. And I do hope that we have the opportunity to welcome you back to the Durham area and to enjoy Duke Gardens again, which I know you enjoyed very much. I'm coming to you today from Atlanta, as you know, each of us dealing with family circumstances of a different kind, and we hope that Alana has a refuah shlema. I want to give lots of people an opportunity to respond and to ask questions. I will, and you can feel free to put a question in the chat or to raise your hand. Michael, I want to ask you, I'm going to get us started with the first question. And it comes from a book that I brought with me for Passover and ended up reading over the last week and a half, 2 weeks. I imagine you've read it too. It's called People Love Dead Jews. It's by Dara Horn. I'm going to do some more teaching about this in a few weeks at a lunch and learn. I found it fascinating. She's a very good writer. And one of the points that she makes towards the end of the book is the danger that, and I don't have it in front of me, otherwise I would read you a paragraph or two, but the basic idea is that the Holocaust memory can be dangerous because what we're doing is teaching everybody what the Holocaust is, and in doing so, we're sort of putting it out of reach and saying that if you've only done, X, Y, Z, and A, B, C, then it's not the Holocaust, and therefore you shouldn't make the comparison, and you don't have to be worried. And so I just want to ask you to sort of lay out for us, what do you think is?
I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story about that. In the early 1980s, I was involved with the equivalent of the JCRC, the Jewish Community Relations Council. I was served in Washington, D.C. as part of the Jewish Community Relations Council. And I went to a meeting which had a report on Ethiopian Jewry. And the report was the Jews were starving, they were dying, they were being discriminated against, they had malnutrition and deep discrimination, enormous poverty and suffering, but there was no systematic killing. And everybody all of a sudden breathed a sigh of relief. No systematic killing, okay, so Jews are suffering, no big deal. The reality is that we can't allow the Holocaust to be the threshold. And one of the greatest achievements of American Jewry and world Jewry in general was to say that when there was discrimination against Soviet Jewry, we said we want to liberate these people and we don't want them to go and be essentially descend into all of that. So there is a proper way to remember. And the proper way to remember is not to have to build a tolerance level for acceptable levels of evil. And if it ain't the Holocaust, it ain't important. But to really believe that we have a certain sense of solidarity and obligation. And as I said in my remarks, I was in Poland yesterday. In fact, it may have been today, but I'm a little bit groggy to begin with. I was in Poland yesterday and I saw the way in which refugees were being treated. I saw, for example, in Poland, and you have to imagine as a historian how difficult it is to say that we feel like a Ukrainian, solidarity with Ukrainians who were perpetrators as well as victims during the Holocaust. But people are opening their homes. The Jewish Community Center in Krakow is feeding 600 meals a day, 3 times a day. Kosher meals, kosher Passover meals in Poland, 600 people a day. People have welcomed refugees into their home. People are responding differently. Again, when you compare the way in which the Jews, these were strangers, but these are the same religion and the same color. And you have to see that as one of the ways. So I think we have to be careful that we use the Holocaust not as the threshold at which we act, but as the example that spurs us to action much earlier in the process of discrimination and of destruction.
And is there a way to do that without it becoming cheapened or us becoming
we're all scared. We're all scared out of our mind about the cheapening of the Holocaust, and we're all and I conceptually years ago when I was building the Holocaust Museum in Washington, I conceptually told people that comparison is not equivalence. In other words, to compare is always what we had in high school, to compare and contrast. So comparison is not equivalence. But we also have to be very careful that we don't have trivialization. Masks are not Jewish stars. Jewish stars were symbolization en route to destruction. Masks were mutual protection. The idea that you compare, part of what we're doing today is comparing everything to the Holocaust. It's a way of shouting, this is evil, pay attention. That's a trivialization of the Holocaust and ultimately its reduction. And part of what we have to do is make sure that now that survivors are not going to be with us much longer, that we assume that responsibility to use the word carefully and not to use the word cheaply. By the way, Jews sometimes use the word cheaply. All of a sudden, you have an action that takes place, or somebody's saying an anti-Semitic statement, even if they're opposing Israel, et cetera, say another Holocaust is on the horizon. No, we have to carefully husband it, otherwise it becomes trivialized. And we see in our society, in many contemporary societies, there's a trivialization of everything. And that, I think, merits caution.
Sharon wrote in the chat, and I want to just lift up the extraordinary work that Sharon does as the executive director of the North Carolina efforts around Holocaust education. She works with survivors and with many students in the public schools. And she wrote in the chat, those of us who work with students are often asked what they as individuals can do. They feel overwhelmed. Michael, I'm just curious, what suggestions do you have as each one of us does this work of memory in our lives in the community?
First of all, I have to say that I know of Sharon's work, and I know of the efforts in North Carolina. I have been going for the last 12 or 13 years, with the exception of the COVID year, and even that I did remotely. I've been going to Appalachian State University when they have teacher training in the summer, and it's my annual retreat. In fact, we had a problem 2 weeks before Passover, which is I come home and my wife's in a panic, and she thinks we have a rat in my closet. Turned out it was my Daniel Boone hat from my first trip to Appalachian State. I was in Boone, North Carolina. And what do you do in Boone, North Carolina? You buy a Boone hat, which was my Purim costume for that year. And apparently it fallen down from the shelf. So that's my humor. Now that's humor, but let me answer Sharon's question. First thing is we can't say cheaply never again. We have to say never again, not with my silence, not with my assent, not without my protest, and the like. Students have an obligation to be what we call Holocaust education, has introduced a very important concept into the world. One of the greatest of all Holocaust scholars was Raoul Hilberg, who spoke about perpetrators, victims, bystanders. And he gave a too easy typology. Number one, we see that there are more than bystanders. There are enablers, there are collaborators, there are a whole range of things. But what Yad Vashem calls the righteous among the nations of the earth, I call upstanders. Because my feeling is that students don't aspire to be righteous unless they're in religious schools. If they're in Catholic schools or yeshivot, they aspire to be righteous. Most of us can aspire to be decent and can aspire to be upstanders. So what I ask of students is to be upstanders in their community, to act locally and think globally, and to, again, if a genocide is taking place, like the genocide taking place in China now, then your obligation is to write to your congressman and congresswoman to protest. It's to write to NBC and say you can't deal with the Olympics without dealing with this. It's to take all sorts of communal action. Join a group that fights genocide, Doctors Without Borders, Jewish World Watch, a whole range of things that are possible. Act locally, think globally, and act as if you want to be an upstander, because that's what's morally required of us in our world today.
Thank you. Let me give an opportunity to others to ask questions. I also want to just note Sharon's husband, Dr. Ed Halperin, who's the chancellor of Torah Medical College, and I hope that the two of you have a chance to talk. As Ed, I don't know if it's happened yet. I know that there was scheduled to be a wonderful seminar on having to do with the medicine practice. Will you say just another word about that?
2022 is the 75th anniversary of the issuing of verdicts in what is called the Nuremberg doctors' trial. Approximately 25 physicians and hospital administrators were placed on trial for crimes against humanity. The trial began in 1946 and ended in the spring of 1947. On Thursday of this week, we are hosting an international symposium, online and in person, in which we will have 4 speakers discuss the history and the implication of the Nuremberg doctors' trial. I have posted the sign-on information in multiple places, but if you don't have it, please email me or just look it up online. Nuremberg doctors' trial, New York Medical College, Touro University. As of an hour ago, 800 people have signed up from around the world to attend. We have Dr. Robert Lifton, the author of the book, The Nazi Doctors, Dr. Professor George Anas of Boston University, a leading authority on public health and law, as well as a scholar about Robert Jackson. And something I've never hosted before, one of the children of one of the guards of Adolf Eichmann will speak. It may be of interest to some of you that Adolf Eichmann was only guarded by Sephardic guards, no Ashkenazi guards. They were worried that someone might choose to take matters into their own hands. And the son of one of the guards lives near the college. He's going to come tell us about his father's experiences. Everyone's welcome. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Dr. Halpern, I worked, I believe, with one of your predecessors who had an interest in this, and that is Jerome Barondis, who may have been your predecessor at New York Medical College. Oh, probably about 25 years ago.
I think it is unlikely because 25 years ago, New York Medical College was part of the Roman Catholic Archdiocesan health system.
Okay.
Well,
I have it's 25 years old, but I want to tell one story. I just wrote the foreword to a book on medicine in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I think this is illustrative of something fascinating. You understand medical conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto were so horrific that 10% of the population died in 1941 before there was a bullet fired, and 20% of the population died in the 6.5 months between January 1 and the first deportation of July 23rd, 1942. To alleviate this situation, the doctors in the Warsaw Ghetto created a medical school, a nursing school, and a pharmacy school to train people to assist them. And most remarkably of all, their training was so decent and so good, even under oppression, that after the war, the Warsaw University recognized their courses for medical credit. And this was the initiative. And the other thing we should also tell our people, which is informed consent was the first principle articulated in the Nuremberg trial's conclusion that said a patient is entitled to be informed of their treatment and to consent to it. And the second principle, or maybe even the third, was that they had a right to stop treatment at any time. Because one of the great things that Robert J. Lifton taught us is that he interviewed the Nazi doctors not only because they were men, but because they were doctors, and there was something about a physician's training that, if it's not coupled with humanity and ethics, can be profoundly dangerous. And that's one of the great contributions of Robert J. Lifton. He's got to be in his 90s by now.
Yes, when I went to his apartment to invite him, I said, Dr. Lifton, you know, you're said to be the single most famous living graduate of New York Medical College. He said, really? Who said that? I said, Wikipedia. He said, it must be true then. We are, I believe, we are the first higher education institution in the world to have an endowed chair in biomedical ethics after the Holocaust, which was donated to us by a wealthy gentleman this year, and probably the only medical school in the United States that has a required first-year medical school course in bioethics after the Holocaust, where we talk about some of the issues you just discussed. Yes.
Well, let me give the opportunity. We're at 8:03, but just is one more question. If anybody, I haven't seen any hands, but if anybody would like to ask one more question before we wrap up for the evening. Well, Michael, I want to say thank you. A deep thanks. I always learn each time that we talk, each time that we meet. You've given a great gift to our community in helping us to connect with the larger Jewish community in the world, with the state of Israel as it remembers the Holocaust this week. Oh, Ursula, I saw you just raise your hand. Was that a question that you had?
No, this is not Ursula. That's her husband. She's not here right now. I wonder if I could ask one question.
Please.
I really have the highest respect for Michael Berenbaum. In 1993, he published his book, The World Must Know. I have a copy of it right here. The History of the Holocaust as Told in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I think of all the hundreds of books I have on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust and other genocides, this is a remarkable achievement. I congratulate Mr. Berenbaum for having written the text. It's extremely well written and documented, and in particularly the hundreds of pictures, photographs he included. That is, again, a remarkable achievement. And I certainly thank you, Mr. Berenbaum, for all the service you have done, your time you have given, the compassion you have shown time and again. And I don't know exactly how old you are, but I hope you will live for many more years to come. I have
tell us your question.
Yeah, the question is, I taught the Holocaust at Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and then I took many of my students to the Holocaust Museum, and I took students to Europe, and at least 12 different times. I took them to Auschwitz and Mauthausen and so on, to the concentration camps. My concern right now is that when I mention the Holocaust in conversation, there's very little reaction by people. So as if my feeling is most people know very little now about the Holocaust. Not only that, which is even more scary, they're not interested, they're indifferent. And so as time goes on and more of the Holocaust survivors pass away, who will speak on behalf of history? Who will teach the Holocaust? What is being done in schools? And I'm very concerned about that. And what really scares me are politicians who make frequently comments about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. And frankly, they have really only a superficial or no information on the Holocaust.
Let's hear him answer. Let's hear him answer.
Let me say, first of all, I would say right now, politicians frighten me, period. And that is that I'm deeply disturbed by political discourse throughout the world at this moment. And that is that, but let me say, I think there is a deep and profound commitment to remembering the Holocaust among a core group of people who really believe that it is of enormous moral and historical importance to remember the Holocaust, and that it is one of the important ways to talk about racism, anti-Semitism, discrimination, and a whole range of issues. I think there are groups of people who really regard studying the Holocaust as a transformative event in their lives and as of significant moral import. Maybe not enough. Certainly, there's a general awareness of the Holocaust, but not a specific level of knowledge. And let me give you a piece of evidence of general awareness of the Holocaust, which is that these misstatements would not work unless there was a certain recognition that this is an important event. I regard it in my work as what I call the negative absolute in a world of relativism. We don't know what's good, we don't know what's bad, but the one thing we know is this was evil. And consequently, say something was evil, you compare it to the Holocaust, which is a way of screaming, a way of shouting, and a way of dealing with the anguish of that. I wish there was more knowledge, and part of what I've devoted my career to is to dissemination of this information in a way that is comprehensible to the general public. I had a wonderful, Daniel knows this very well, Rabbi Graber, I'm speaking to your congregation, but Daniel should be fine on this. They had a wonderful joke about Martin Buber, which is Martin Buber, who was one of the great thinkers of the 20th century. They joked about him. His writing in Hebrew was the clearest of all his writing because he did not know Hebrew well enough to write obscurely in it. Now, and Buber knew Hebrew very, very well, but he didn't write obscurely in it. So I try not to write obscurely with the idea, and I model myself on certain teachers with the idea that it doesn't diminish your contribution to serious scholarship to write clearly and comprehensively in a way, in a way in which the general public can understand it. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than you, a little bit more pessimistic about politicians than you, but I may have hung around with them more than you, which also is not very good for the soul.
And Michael, I included in your, I could not read the entire bio, but I did make sure to highlight sections. And one of them that I did is the tremendous work that you've done in TV and in film. And you are strategically located there in Los Angeles at my alma mater, American Jewish University, in helping to do some of that responsible popularization or responsible education through the powerful work of the media. So I want to say thank you again. We will await another opportunity to welcome you to Duke Gardens and to welcome you back to Bethel. I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. And I will encourage everybody this week to take part in the various commemorations, and the program that Ed Halpern has, will certainly be extraordinary. And I wish everybody only good things. And thanks for joining us.
Okay. Bye-bye.